Welcome back to another edition of the Prepper Recon Podcast. Our mission is to bring you great interviews with preppers from around the world so you can be better informed and better prepared for everything from a hurricane to the end of the world as we know it. I've been purchasing gold and silver from JM Bullion since before they were a show sponsor because they had the lowest overspot price of any dealer I've been able to find. JM Bullion now offers free shipping on all orders, and Prepper Recon podcast listeners will get $5 off any order over $300. Just go to jmbullion.com and use coupon code PR5 at checkout. This episode is brought to you by CampingSurvival.com. Whether your plan is to bug out or bug in, CampingSurvival.com has all of your preparedness needs, including bug-out bags, long-term storage food, water filters, gas masks, and first aid kits. Check them out online today at CampingSurvival.com. Be sure to enter coupon code PrepperRecon for a 5% discount on your entire order. Today's guest is Fabian Calvo of Fabian for Liberty podcast. Fabian, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Mark. It's a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. It's an honor to have you on. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what woke you up to our current predicament?
Certainly, yeah. So I've, my early 20s, late teens, I was in and out of college. I barely graduated high school. Really because of my parents that were, they were immigrants and they really bought into the paradigm of once you're in America, or, basically the whole American dream is you go to school, you get a good education, then you go and get a good job. And, even though my dad was a small business owner, I was raised believing that paradigm. And in my early 20s, I'm in college. It's not really working out for me. I was at an art school. I basically dropped out. I'm like, this is not for me. I had a string of about 6 or 7 different jobs in one summer, and then quickly realized that the job paradigm wasn't for me either. And so, from there, I looked around and I noticed that most of the people that I knew that were doing well or that had any good, type of financial stability in their life were somehow involved in real estate. So I dove into the real estate market and basically learned everything I could. And basically fast forward to today, I own and operate a private equity fund called the Note House. And really, Mark, I'd say that in going through the '08 collapse and even before that, I've always been really politically active. Since I was a kid, I've always been involved reading the newspaper, just was always really involved in history and in politics. And I really started waking up around '05, '06, as I was kind of ramping up to help Ron Paul in his campaign. I was a precinct captain for him in 2007. And as the collapse unfolded in '08, I really realized how centrally planned our economy was, how unfree market it was. And being on the front lines of that collapse through my real estate companies, just really went down the rabbit hole, Mark, and seeing how we have really a group of authoritarian elites that really have hijacked our republic and what I believe their plans are for the republic and for our country and this massive cycle of dependence that they've created. So it's really been a process, I think, like many, and I think like many listening as well. When you wake up, you kind of have a moment or a period of your time where you're consumed by it. And I definitely was for some time. And I really have learned to kind of integrate it into my life so I could lead a successful life with, my family, with my health and all kinds of other components while realizing the true nature of the world we live in.
And what do you think the biggest threat to our current system is right now? Is it the oppressive government that you just spoke about, market instability, lack of rule of law in Wall Street and in D.C., or all of the above?
All of the above. I'd say all of those are great points. Great. I mean, those are all hellfire missiles to the very foundations of liberty. But I'd say for me, the number one, based on just seeing how it's unfolded in history, is the dependency paradigm that's been created. We have, in essence, created such a vast entitlement group in America, where now over 100 million in some case or another are dependent on government, and that number continues to increase. And I think that looking back in other histories, in other civilizations, when you have a group of a population that are really more takers than producers, they're really willing to do whatever government will tell them in order to continue to secure their entitlement payments or their whatever kind of gimmick or promise that has been made to them. And you see that with either unions that have been lied to, these pension funds that are totally bankrupt and people depending on their pensions, people that are in line for their Social Security, whatever it may be. This vast group of people that are dependent on government, not on themselves. And I find that as a real threat to liberty and freedom, because ultimately I think when they try to pull the plug on the system, they will look to those masses to go along with whatever plans they have.
Yeah, I think Peter Schiff's analogy for that is that there's more people in the wagon and less folks pulling the wagon. So at some point, the folks pulling the wagon are overwhelmed by the weight of the people in the wagon. So yeah, that's a good point. And they've sort of secured their votes by keeping.
Yeah, that's exactly, Mark, the plan, and it's a very dangerous plan, because I think one of the things that I think listeners need to realize is that the idea of human liberty and of free societies has really been a rarity in the last 5,000 years of recorded human history. That's what makes America different, is that it pretty much led the way in setting up a form of government that really did allow for free humanity. And then shortly after, America being a very young country, has been one of the longest living republics in existence. It was hijacked, and with the being set up, and we've seen all of these big government agendas unfold, and it's really been damaging to a free humanity, and that's I think one of the biggest dangers that we face today. People need to realize that the idea of you being able to have freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, that's really rare in the world we live in. The history of mankind, for the most part, has been slavery and tyranny, living under the king or living under the pharaoh or whatever it may be.
And how are you feeling about 2014? Could this be the year it all falls apart, or do we have a little bit more time?
I think, Mark, we have, as far as economically speaking, and again, being on the front lines of the market, I think that we have likely a couple more years before the wheels fall off the bus, if you will. When I look around and I see mega billionaires, some of the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds, in fact, the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund from Norway, and many other hedge funds, Wall Street, private equity funds, buying up, hundreds, if not billions of dollars worth of real estate, getting billions of dollars worth of lines of credit from the big mega banks, and then securitizing these rental properties. Just that component alone, I say to myself, well, one, I think the system still hasn't created enough debt. I think that they enrich themselves by the more debt they create, because the American taxpayer is the one who pays the debt. They're able to siphon off vast amounts of money to enrich themselves. And I think they're still letting that play out. So I think that, there's a lot of people that are saying, well, we could face a collapse here in the next, this year or by April. And, I don't think anyone knows when the collapse will ultimately happen. But based on what I see in the marketplace, as manipulated as all the markets are, I think there's still a couple more years before we have some kind of fundamental reset in the economy.
And you just mentioned the securitization of real estate and the physical real estate now, as opposed to what we had before with the mortgage market. Mm-hmm. Do you think that could bring volatility into the real estate market that we saw it bring into the debt market in 2008?
Well, yeah. It's really interesting how the authoritarians in charge really they continue to repeat history. I'll give you a non-financial example, then I'll address your question. Non-financial, as we saw recently, Obama trying to invade Syria using the false pretense of weapons of mass destruction, and it pretty much failed. People woke up and they're like, we're not going to repeat this folly. Now, with the financial markets, it's interesting to see that in 2008, we have the mortgage-backed securities being sold Warren Buffett's company, stamping the rating agency, stamping them AAA. And ultimately they sell this garbage to countries all around the world. And they fail. Well, now, fast forward 6 years later, they're pretty much doing the same exact thing, but they're doing it instead of, like you said, with mortgages, although they're still doing it with mortgages. They're now doing it with rental properties. So all of these bank foreclosures that have been bought up by groups like Blackstone, and Colony Capital and many of these other, hedge funds, they're buying up this real estate. They're renting them out. And then they're securitizing them. So really they bypass the hassle of trying to sell the home. Now they can just sell the securities, and it just adds so much stress to an already inflated bubble. It's going to be really interesting to see how that unfolds.
And what are your expectations for 2014 for the common guy on the street for real estate?
Well, I personally think, as somebody who is an educator for real estate investors and beginners, people who want to get involved in the real estate market, whether to buy their own home, buy their survival retreat, or make it a business, regardless of how manipulated the market is. I mean, the bottom line is every market is manipulated, stocks, bonds, you name it. But you see that in all of these asset classes, there's educated investors that are able to make a living and prosper from it. And I think for the average Joe on the street, quite frankly, and this has been proven true for my life, so that's why I'm such a strong advocate of this, is that real estate's really the only asset class, Mark, where somebody can get involved in, buy and sell, and really be able to monetize the market without having to put money out of their own pocket. They could bring in an investor, they could implement a couple different strategies for buying and selling and investing. So I think it's a great opportunity in this environment to be able to get involved and get in and out of the market, not take on any long-term debt, but be able to find value and monetize that value in the real estate market. Because here's the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest threat to the globalist, to the New World Order, is the individuals that are not only awake and not only prepared, but that have financial resources to be able to opt out of their dependence paradigm. I mean, the more people listening that are completely dependent, are completely independent from their government programs, from their pensions, from their job paradigm, that is real, I think, coffin nails for them, right? A society that's dependent on themselves, that looks to their family or their community instead of government for help. That's what America used to be like. And that's why I've become such a proponent and I'm working hard to help educate others on the values of entrepreneurship. Whether it's you want to be a real estate investor or not, I would really consider as part of your preparations to really consider entrepreneurship as a way to financially be prepared.
And then you mentioned a home versus a survival retreat. Do you have a preference for those? I mean, a lot of people, they work in a metropolitan area or whatever it is that necessitates that they sort of be in the area that they're in,
sure.
Family and all of those other things. Would you recommend them to downsize and get a smaller home and then to take the rest of that money and to purchase a survival retreat?
Well, I mean, look, I think that there are a lot of people, like you said, they have other obligations that don't allow them to move out into the woods or move out to, more rural, less populated areas. I think that one of the most important things that people can do, is begin the process of opting out of having that dependence on the job. For example, I am a real estate investor. That's the nature of my business, the Note House. And I do that from my home computer. I mean, I have offices, but for the most part, I work from my home. And I would encourage people that, especially in today's age, I mean, unless the power grid goes down and the internet goes down, which if it does, of course, all bets are off. But being able to tap into becoming an entrepreneur allows you to be able to work from home, if that's kind of one of the lines you go down, and then you have more flexibility as, okay, well now I can make an income from pretty much anywhere in the world, which I think is an absolutely critical, a critical point for any prepper should be, how can I sustain myself financially, without having to report to a 9 to 5. I think for me, as somebody who takes preparedness very, very seriously, that's something that I've worked at for a very long time, and I'm happy to say that I've achieved that goal, and so I would encourage others to do so. With respect to having a survival retreat, there's a lot of considerations that people obviously have to make, but I definitely am a believer that if you are able to either live in a location that's really lightly populated, or have the ability to get to a location like that very quickly, I think that's of the utmost importance.
And while we're on the subject of real estate, I saw a special a few months ago. It was from 60 Minutes Australia, I think, and it was about these huge cities in China, and there's about 20 of them about the size of Manhattan that are completely built out, and nobody lives in them. Number one, does that have the possibility to cause disruptions in the markets around the world? And also, number two, will China likely switch over to a military-industrial complex to start trying to pilfer wealth because it's worked so well for America?
Well, I'll tell you, Mark, I have a whole entire theory that I've been working on and researching. My crew has for several years now, and I have, just in the business that I've been in, I've been able to meet a lot of very affluent individuals that, let's just say, have the ear of people at the Fed and other highest levels of government. And so I am convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that we are in the midst of what I call the global economic reset. Some refer to it as a currency reset. And I think China is a big player in that reset. I think ultimately, somewhere down the line, the dollar will lose its world reserve currency status as the world reserve currency alone, likely will go into a basket of currencies. Now, the reason I mention all this with respect to the ghost cities is that I think ultimately the plan for China, which is a very centrally planned economy, is that they're going to populate those ghost cities with all of the people that live out in the country. I mean, most of China's population is rural. They're going to try to relocate them into the cities, pretty much like you saw in America. I mean, at the Great Depression, you had a majority of Americans live out in the country. And after the Great Depression, as they became more industrialized, people moved to the cities. And that's what I think what the plans long term are for the Chinese economy and for China in general. I mean, they think very long term, as do the globalists. They have long term plans, and that's I think ultimately what's going to happen with those ghost cities.
And you mentioned the dollar there briefly, but can you just give us a little bit more explanation of what do you think is going to happen to the dollar post-economic reset? Well,
I think there's almost 100% probability that everyone listening to this will continue to use the dollar throughout their lifetime. The question is whether it'll continue to be the world reserve currency or not. And it's interesting to see, Mark, it's almost comical to see all of these people that come out and for whatever reason feel they have an obligation, or maybe they really believe it, that they must defend the notion that the dollar will always be the world reserve currency. I completely beg to differ. The world reserve currency is something that does not last forever as far as the country who controls the currency. And we've seen it's 6 times throughout history, at least in modern history, that it's been reset. And we go back thousands of years in history and we see Romans currency, the Greek or the Chinese currency over 1,000 years ago be hyperinflated, and then there's some kind of new medium of exchange that's used. The dollar is no different. We're the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, not to mention the unfunded liabilities and the derivatives that could single-handedly take down the U.S. economy. You're seeing a world also that is beginning to realize the financial obligations that the United States have are completely unsustainable. And it's why you see China, Russia, Brazil, begin to enter into bilateral trade agreements. And I think that ultimately here's what will happen. I think ultimately you'll see countries led likely by the IMF and the World Bank come out and demand there be some new structure to the way the financial markets globally work. And what I mean by that is they're likely to first be a basket of currencies where the dollar may participate along with the euro. But ultimately, I think some kind of Chinese currency, likely gold-backed, will be what the world shifts to. The Chinese currency has a long way to go, but you see evidence of this every single day almost, whether it just replaced the euro as the secondly most used currency, or just, we find out a couple days ago, it's not official yet, that China became the number one trading country in the world. So just, it's really 1945 all over again. The war hasn't started yet, but we are seeing, just like we saw back then, the shift from England to America. We're seeing that now happen, this shift from America to China.
And the Feds keep saying that they're continuing to target low rates, but the 10-year rate on the 10-year Treasury has almost doubled from last spring. Are they losing control?
Very good point, Mark. They ultimately will lose control. The free hand of the market will always win. Free markets will always win because the Fed, as much as they try, cannot control the market. It's a natural thing that happens, and no matter how much you centrally plan the economy, ultimately the markets win. And so they claimed that they tapered. I don't believe they're tapering. My contacts, my research, and basically people that I know that are in the know have told me that the QE that's been taking place has been upwards of $125 billion a month. Much of that additional money above the 85 that was told to the public being used to bail out other banks around the world, particularly those in Europe who have not recapitalized their banks as they've done for the most part in America, because now it's the Western world that's technically bankrupted that is now looking to the United States as far as this world reserve currency structure that's set up. And in order to keep that system afloat, you need to have massive amounts of liquidity created, which is what you're seeing with the Fed, in order to prop up these balance sheets from these countries that are bankrupt. If you or I, Mark, had run up, millions of dollars in debt, and ultimately we couldn't service that debt with making the interest payments, it would be the equivalent of us going into our basements and counterfeiting money to pay those debts. Well, that's what the Fed's doing. And so, of course, ultimately, they're going to lose control because the way they lose control is that people just realize, look, America's biggest export is inflation. Inflation in China in the last 10 years is up over 200%. And much of that has to do with the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. So ultimately they lose control. And in that loss of control, we'll see, I think, a fundamental reset of the economy that very likely could be centered around regional and global wars.
And what does the economic reset look like in your mind, Fabian? What's the worst case scenario that we should prepare for? Is it just this continued downward spiral of our living standard? Or is it the zombie apocalypse or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I think it's really a zombie apocalypse happens if it gets so bad and you begin to see the grids go down, you begin to see, police and military not show up because they want to stay home with their families and protect their families. So that happens, I think. Worst case scenario happens if the grid goes down. I think realistically what we see happen, and I would obviously, the people that are listening to this great show that are preppers have a contingency plan for all of the above. But I think worst case scenario, or not worst case, but I think the most realistic scenario is we see almost a repeat of the Great Depression, which during that period of time will allow for a reset and a restructure of all of these debts that cannot be paid, whether it's the pension system. A great point here is the the judge who's overseeing the Detroit bankruptcy case that comes out in a statement and says, look, there's no difference between pension debt and any other debt in the bankruptcy case. And so I think during the reset, America falls into a much greater depression. It's much more prolonged. Unemployment rate is much higher. And you'll see during this process, debts being reworked, basically pensions being rewritten, haircuts being taken across the board. And it's going to be really difficult for a majority of people that aren't prepared for this. Products that you shop for at the grocery stores will increase, in my opinion, by 2 or 3-fold, because China won't, U.S. won't have that world reserve currency status any longer that has given us really that ability to buy, cheap products from China for, a flat screen TV for $100 or whatever it may be. So it's going to be an extremely painful adjustment, and it's an adjustment, Mark, that could very well lead to revolution. I mean, as I've said all along, looking back in history, global economic resets typically not only reset the economy, but they reset the political system, they reset borders, they reset all kinds of things, and I think that's likely what we're in for.
So what steps can people start to take now to distance themselves from this failing system? You spoke a little bit earlier about, breaking free. Can you just go in depth a little bit more about how you did it, and then what people can do to personalize your plan?
Yeah, well, I would, first and foremost, I would have all of the needed preparations taken care of. I mean, obviously things like food and water, people must be able to sustain themselves for, in my opinion, at least a year, while the reset plays itself out. So I think that's very, very important. I think that as a family, you come together, you have contingency plans, you consider where it is you live, if you need to relocate, what are your friends and neighbors, what are your neighbors like? What's your city like? Do you think they're able to, handle, the mess that will be created from a collapse type environment, or from an economic, reset type environment? So I think people need to really take inventory of that and be, prepared with, obviously, guns, food, and then also, I'm a big proponent of gold and silver. Now, because we don't know when this event will happen, I'm a huge proponent, like I said a little bit earlier, in people being prepared economically speaking as well. And I personally do that through, my entrepreneurship and the different companies that I run. And I believe, with just 100% convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt, Mark, 'cause I've seen this so many times with so many other people, that we happen to live in a world that anyone can pretty much almost, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part can make a living doing what it is that they love. All of us and everyone listening has a passion, whether it's preparedness and getting the word out or whatever. We live in a world where you can monetize and make a living and likely replace your day job just focusing on your passion. And, that for 2014, that's going to be a big focus of mine, is helping people, achieve, whether they want to be a real estate investor or they just want to be an entrepreneur, helping put a plan in place for them to do that. But I think, a couple weeks ago, I posted a video on my YouTube channel that went over the first 3 simple steps of what people can do to begin to opt out of the job paradigm. And they're very simple. And the first one is, what's your passion? Most of us have a passion. It's likely what we do when we get home from work or what we do late into the night. What's your passion, and are you an expert in it? I mean, we live in a world where, pretty much information is at your fingertips. And in a very short period of time, you could really polish up and become a real expert leading authority on the subject matter that you love. Step number 2 is, who are others in the field right now, in the passion that you have, that are already making a living, basically catering to that passion? Are they providing a service? Are they providing a product? Are they just providing information? Who are they, and how do they make a living in that niche that you love? And then step number 3 is, begin to build what's often referred to as a tribe, or begin to build an audience by just sharing your passion with the world. I could almost guarantee that anyone listening right now that has a passion, there's a likelihood that there is at least 1 million, if not millions, of people out there that share that passion, that want to hear from you. And, in the pre-interview when we were just talking, Mark, both of us, we're agreeing that, I would consider that this is probably a passion of yours. It's a passion of mine to help others wake up to the insanity in the world we live in today. And so those are 3 simple steps that anyone listening right now could begin to follow to help them opt out of the job paradigm. Because again, I think that's of the utmost importance that you're able to not be dependent on anything this government provides, or for that matter, a job or any of that, or anything like that.
And you mentioned that in your mind you think that the reset might look like a really bad version of the Great Depression. Now, in the Great Depression, and even after the fall of the Weimar Republic, there were lots of great opportunities for the people who planned ahead and positioned themselves. Will we have those types of opportunities after the reset, or are we going to go into some sort of like a black hole from which there's no return? Because after Rome fell, there was a several 100-year period that we affectionately call the Dark Ages.
Sure. You're right. And, that's interesting. I think, in the Weimar Republic, for example, there were great opportunities. There's the story that's often told about how an ounce of gold could buy a block of commercial real estate in downtown Berlin. I think absolutely we'll see those opportunities, and only those that are educated and prepared financially can take advantage of them. But, we also have the situation where in the Weimar Republic, the hyperinflation and the collapse of their economy leads to the rise of a strongman. There's an Indian economist who was really ahead of his time. His name was Ravi Batra. And Ravi Batra came out with really this notion that we go through these different stages, and history always repeats itself. And the stages are, there's this acquisition phase where people are accumulating all kinds of things. Then there's a collapse phase, like a deleveraging, if you will. And then there's the rise of a strongman. And that's something that very well could happen. As I said at the beginning of the interview, with a massive amount of people in the population dependent on government, in a collapse type situation, the prospect of a strongman that comes and rises up and either scapegoats a certain part of the population while also promising to return security and return prosperity to the public becomes something that is really appealing to the masses. I mean, we live in a society today where basically the person who gets elected is the person who says, I'm going to give you the most free stuff. Well, in a collapse type scenario, or in the Great Depression type scenario, Great Depression 2.0, if you will, in America, yes, there'll be great opportunities, but people need to realize that those opportunities, although in America, could be in America, they could be anywhere around the world. I mean, the difference between Weimar and now, or the Great Depression in America in the 30s and now, is that now the world's a global economy. There's nothing stopping. So even if America enters the Dark Ages, that's not stopping somebody from, setting up their residence, or setting up their business, or their family compound, or whatever it may be in Costa Rica or Panama or Mongolia or Cambodia. So that's something else as we talk about preparedness that I would consider people, especially people that are retired, that don't really need to live in America, or those that are out of college or maybe still in college. I would really have them consider looking abroad for opportunities that exist.
And then you touched on gold and silver briefly. Can you tell us what your expectations are for gold and silver in 2014?
Well, I think we'll probably see more of the same. I don't necessarily think we're going to see a tremendous rise in price in gold and silver. But I do believe, I'm a big proponent of gold and silver. I buy every single month. I think silver and gold are at an absolute spectacular sale right now. If the price went to $100 tomorrow, I would likely sell everything in my possession to buy more of it. And again, just like I said a little bit ago, how the very uber wealthy and uber elite are investing in real estate like crazy. Those same people are buying gold and silver like crazy. And there's a reason why, the price is being manipulated downwards, but physical demand is at an all-time high. And I think that really speaks to where, to what the prospects for this market really are. I was reading a great book about Calvin Coolidge. A lot of people don't really hear about the depression of 1919, or the depression that happened early in the 20th century. They don't hear about it because, Calvin Coolidge comes probably one of the real last presidents that implemented real free market policies and cut taxes dramatically. But, you know, as World War I breaks out and he was a politician in Massachusetts, it was interesting to see the scramble by the world's elite to basically move their gold around. So, you know, gold is something, it always goes back to gold. As I said earlier, the free market always wins, and gold always wins. Because when fiat currencies fail, and we have a long history of fiat currencies failed, hundreds and hundreds of fiat currencies have failed, and when they fail, it always goes back to gold and silver. So I would definitely make gold and silver a central part of your financial plans to make sure that when it all goes down, you know, you have something of real value that you can use to trade, to barter, or to just basically survive.
And you mentioned gold moving around. I think in the late 60s, Charles de Gaulle tried to recall all of his gold from America, and I think that was one of the things that triggered us going off of the gold standard completely when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. We're sort of seeing that now. Didn't last year we had Germany wanted to repatriate their gold and they were told that it would take them 7 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's also the idea of Fort Knox being completely empty of gold. You have a lot of politicians, senators, congressmen that have really made it part of their policies to try to audit the reserves of gold in Fort Knox. And you know, I've heard from people that are in the offices of these politicians that have, I mean, I'm talking, Mark, they call every week about when can I get in, when could I get in, and they just keep getting the runaround for, you know, months and months and months. I think that's really, really telling. I believe that the Federal Reserve, who is supposed to hold roughly 9,000 tons of gold, or the U.S. government, and the Fed holds a lot of it in New York in their vaults, under the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, you know, there's a high probability that most of that is gone, or if it's being held on to, they're not going to let it go because they know exactly what I'm talking about with respect to the global economic reset. They know it's coming, and they know gold's going to play a central part in it.
And I think that the reason Charles de Gaulle recalled the gold to France was because he knew the dollar was a Ponzi scheme and there was more dollars out there than there was gold to back it. And I wonder if Germany has some inclination of that same sort of thing right now. So you've certainly given us a lot of great information to think about today. Well, first of all, let's mention your YouTube channel, because you've had a YouTube channel for quite a while, but then recently on Fabian for Liberty, you've also added a podcast so that you're able to download the podcast now, and you've just done that in the last couple of months. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's for now it's an audio podcast, but in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be a full video podcast. It's also going to have a newsletter component as well, where we talk about financial markets and a lot of other things. But yeah, they can go to iTunes, or they can just go to FabianForLiberty.com, and they can download it directly there or listen to it live. And, you know, I cover a lot about entrepreneurship, a lot about helping people get out of the job paradigm, while covering the latest with the police state and economic collapse that's unfolding.
And then you also have a lot of good educational products on your page as well if people want to get into investing in real estate or the real estate mortgage market.
Exactly. I mean, you know, FabianForLiberty.com is a resource where basically it'll connect them to all my other sites. They could also go to FabianCalvo.me, FabianCalvo.me for more information on all my other companies and brands and things that I have going on. You know, I've made it a goal this year, for this year and next, Mark, to help do whatever I can to basically create the new class of entrepreneur. Over 1 million entrepreneurs that I think that's a real economic stimulus. I think if you have real entrepreneurs out there creating real wealth, creating real prosperity, and creating real jobs for people, you know, we have an opportunity to turn the tide. And I think doing that while simultaneously waking people up. You know, we saw recently with Syria, as I mentioned earlier, this invasion really being stopped by the outcry of people that understood that it was a total scam. If we could get people to go and make the leap from understanding weapons of mass destruction narrative is a total fraud scam, and make the leap to understand that the fractional reserve banking system and Ponzi scheme that's the Federal Reserve is a complete scam, I think we have an opportunity here to really restore the republic. And I'm all in that, and I'm going to continue to champion that to really as much as I can.
And of course, we'll have links to Fabian for Liberty from today's show notes on the website. But now for the folks listening on Stitcher and iTunes and YouTube, it's Fabian, the number 4, Liberty. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
Very good. Fabian, thanks so much for taking time to come on today's show.
I appreciate it, Mark. Thanks for having me. Keep up the great work.
Hey Preppers and Patriots, my new book, American Exit Strategy, Book 1 of the Economic Collapse Chronicles, is now available in audiobook format through Amazon, iTunes, and Audible. Of course, you can still purchase the Kindle edition or paperback edition through Amazon as well. God-fearing patriots and those who believe in the Constitution will find this near-future dystopian novel to be right up their alley. Those who are looking to be more informed about the potential threat to America's financial stability will learn what to watch for and how to prepare themselves for an economic collapse. In Book 1, America is on the cusp of financial annihilation. Matt and Karen Baer face the challenges of Main Street during a full-scale financial meltdown. Government borrowing and monetary creation have reached their limits. When funds are no longer available for government programs, widespread civil unrest erupts across the country. Matt and Karen are forced to move to a more remote location, and their level of preparedness is revealed as being much less adequate than they believed prior to the crisis. Meanwhile, Paul Randall, a third-party presidential candidate, arises to push back against the welfare and warfare spending that have bankrupted our country. Paul Randall proposes a plan to mitigate the coming hyperinflationary collapse, which is a mathematical certainty. His plan is known as the American Exit Strategy. American Exit Strategy uses survival fiction to take an in-depth look at the real-life politics and economics behind the issues that are likely to trigger a currency collapse or financial meltdown in the near future. American Exit Strategy is a work of fiction until it becomes history. Get your copy today at AmericanExitStrategy.com or through Amazon. God bless and happy prepping.